And here we are, the final lesson taught digitally over the long distance between the Caribbean and wherever you happen to be. Today we are starting a four-part micro unit on trade. Specifically, it's officially trade from 1450 to 1750, but you'll notice the lack of dates here, and that's because technically this could span a lot of time, but you do need to label this section the trade micro unit because, man, a four-part mini unit would be just enough content to make a really good quiz. Hint, hint. First of our trade goods is sugar, and sugar is probably. There are some other candidates. Tobacco is a good one. Any number of people could claim any number of drugs. We're not going to go down that road. But sugar is a legitimate candidate for the crop responsible for the most human misery of all time. And I ain't just talking about toothaches. So let's dive in. All right, first you're looking at a map of the Caribbean. One thing you'll notice if you look down in the bottom left of the map is that every one of the major colonizing powers. No, the Portuguese aren't on there, but you and I both know that they ran Brazil. You learned that yesterday. Those guys, everybody is complicit in what you're going to learn about today. And I'm not going to lie to you. Today's lesson is dark. Today's lesson, oh, sugar, how can it be so bad? It's so tasty and sweet. It's bad. Okay, so to understand sugar, you must first understand the plant itself, seen here in this handy image to the right. Sugar production, yes, it's the backbone of the Caribbean and Brazilian economy during this time period. I emphasized that like 8 times yesterday. And sugar itself is it comes from sugar cane. It's this very tall grass which is native to somewhere in South or Southeast Asia. Bit of controversy there. Most popular theory is it originates on Papua New Guinea. That's not really relevant to our course. What is relevant is it slowly moves westward, and right before the colonial period, it was produced by Arabs in large numbers. That habit was picked up by Europeans through both trade and through the Reconquista of Spain. And as you can see, right before colonization, check this out, there's going to be a map on the right here in a second. If you look over there, you'll notice that most of Europe wasn't suitable for sugar cultivation. You can only grow sugar in warm places, generally with some sandy soil, but you got to have a real hot climate, and most of Europe doesn't check that box. You have some, if you look off on the western edge to the left-hand side of the map, you'll see the Azores, the Canaries, the Cape Verde Islands were good for sugar cultivation, but it was not until 1492 that Europeans had access to massive areas suited for sugar cultivation. Remember, hot climate, sandy soil, what checks that box? The entirety of the Caribbean checks that box. And as a result, sugar cultivation, sugar production is going to explode. So in addition to being a little bit finicky in terms of its places it likes to grow, sugar is also not a super convenient crop to harvest and get the good stuff out. To get sugar out of sugar cane, you have to cut it, which requires machetes or other thick knives called cane knives. You have to squeeze the juice out. You see what over here on the right? That's actually called a sugar press. And what happens is that would be cranked constantly, and sugar would be fed through those two rollers that you see there at the bottom. I'm going to grab my pen here. That would be fed through those two rollers at the bottom. And those two rollers are close enough to touch. It would squeeze the juice out. The juice is then boiled and crystallized into sugar, processed into molasses, and then finished goods such as rum. You guys did the summer reading, right? Sugar can then be used as a sweetener. It can be used as an ingredient for other stuff. If you've ever baked, you know that. And sugar is jaw-droppingly profitable because in the places where sugar grows, it grows extremely well. And all of the major colonial powers create sugar plantations, and all of these sugar plantations rely upon slave labor. And this is where things take a dark turn. How dark? Well, let's look at that roller again. To get sugarcane all the way through the roller, you had to push through basically to the very edge of where the rollers are. What happens if you push too far? Your arm gets caught. And there would be a person standing by the roller with a hatchet, and any slave whose arm got caught in the roller, their job was to chop the arm off. Why? Well, not to save the slave's life, to make sure that production didn't slow down. That's where we're going for the rest of this slideshow. Buckle up. A sugar plantation was probably the worst possible place anybody who was enslaved could be sent, if the roller thing from earlier didn't clue you in. Here's the issue. We'll look at some of the awful ways to die on a sugar plantation momentarily, but even if they weren't the worst possible destination, which they almost certainly were, as I said, they're absolutely the most common destination. Over 80% of the slaves involved in the West African slave trade wound up in the sugar production industry, either in Brazil or in the Caribbean. The most recent numbers I looked at said 84%. And sugar is hard to harvest. Those cane knives can injure you or the people around you. Almost every step of making sugar, boiling, or excuse me, harvesting, pressing, boiling, producing, it all has the potential for injury or death. And here's the thing. Remember earlier, I said sugar is crazy profitable. In fact, it's so profitable, slaves are usually on sugar plantations worked to death. The reason being, sugar was so profitable, you could afford new ones. And here's a lovely little list of the ways to die on a sugar plantation. My head will block some of it, but you'll notice you could die of exhaustion, dehydration, various beatings. If the boiler exploded, it would kill you. You could be starved to death on purpose or by accident. You could be killed to make a point by the overseer. You have accidents with sugar presses, tropical diseases, any number of horrible ways to die on a sugar plantation, and that's before you take into consideration the fact that about 10% of slaves would have died on the journey across the Atlantic. It's bad, guys. Sugar plantations are truly awful places. They are among the worst places. And remember, I have a decent grasp of history. That's why I teach it. They are among the worst places I can think of. They are right up there with any other awful example you can think of in history. You need to add sugar plantations to them. They are that bad. Slaves on sugar plantations would die at an annual rate between 5 and 10%. That is to say, 1 in 10 to 1 in 20, if you were lucky, would be dead between January 1st and December 31st. That high casualty rate creates a constant demand for new slaves, and that continued right up to the point where people decided that, hey, maybe we shouldn't own other human beings like their property. The slave trade continued for sugar right up to the last point. I'm going to send out a link on Remind to you guys that shows you. It's an interactive map of the transatlantic slave trade. We'll do more with that when we get to the slave trade, but you also need to note how many of those slave ships go to the Caribbean or to Brazil. It's a staggering number. The other thing to know about this is that male slaves were preferred in the sugar colonies because of the intensive labor and the fact that, don't yell at me, don't at me, don't email me, the average male does tend to be stronger than the average female. Yes, there's exceptions to that, but men were the preferred slaves in sugar plantations. The thing is, though, women who did wind up here were given the exact same treatment, same rations, same work expectations, same punishments. It's brutal, guys. Like, nothing I can say about sugar plantations is positive. Um, what this does culturally, and this is neutral, this is not good or bad. What this does culturally is it means that Brazil, but especially the Caribbean, had far more African characteristics than mainland colonies. The religions there are much more of a syncretization between traditional African religion and Roman Catholicism. The cultures in those regions are far more hybridized between the two groups. And again, this is mostly because new slaves kept being fed into this machine. To use the example you're familiar with, the United States of America's slave population was self-sustaining. I mean, remember, the U.S. banned slave trade in, I believe it was 1808, may have been 1807. I apologize for not knowing the exact date. But slavery continued in the United States for almost 60 years after that. If that had happened in the Caribbean, slavery would have died out almost immediately because the slaves would have died out almost immediately. No Caribbean or South American colony ever had a self-sustaining slave population. They were quite literally killed off faster than they could reproduce. And again, you need to understand the numbers and gravity of this. Look on your map. The thicker the line on a on the slave trade map, the more slaves were sent to a location. Unpack the fact, guys, that more slaves were sent to Saudi Arabia, a region that you don't think of as being on the slave trade map. Don't kid yourselves, you don't. More slaves were sent there than were sent to the United States during the African slave trade. Much more staggering, though, is look at the numbers in the Caribbean and in Brazil, guys. It is jaw-dropping. And again, the reason for that is the high mortality rate. We're on to our last slide, and also by far the most difficult one for me to explain. So try to stick with me through this. Please feel free to send an email or a remind message. I'll try to answer them while I'm on the plane. Okay. In the Caribbean, it was extremely common for slave owners to free their slaves either upon their death, what a nice guy, the owner's death, obviously, or for good service. And as a result of this, the Caribbean had a huge free black population, and after a couple of generations, a huge number of people of mixed race, either white and black, black and native, obviously white and native, but that's not really involved in the slave trade. You have a large number of mixed race people on all of these islands and throughout Latin America. And this offers more social and political opportunities to people of color than places like the U.S.'s much more regimented whites on top, slave owners, or excuse me, slaves themselves below, and don't interact, you can't move up. So you have more opportunities. But you will notice that that third bullet is bolded, italicized, and underlined. Racism was still very much alive and well in the Caribbean. Just because you do have people of color in governmental positions, in military positions, in higher social positions, in higher religious positions in the Caribbean than in the United States does not somehow undo racism. Okay? Looking white was considered to be more highly prized. Indeed, people of mixed-race ancestry would often lie about their ancestry to get ahead socially. So sugar does have some long-lasting impacts. We are going to cheerfully look at the sugar plantations one more time in our next unit when we talk about revolution, specifically when we go visit Haiti. It is also not a happy lesson. Hey, thank you guys for doing this whole digital lesson thing. I know it's not quite as fun as me being there. At least I hope it's not. You know, I missed you guys while I was down in Puerto Rico. I'm sure I did. And I will see you all on Monday, and I can't wait to see you again. Take care.